They walked into that courtroom thinking they were the predators. But they had no idea they were stepping into a cage I had built from their own lies. My parents demanded my entire fortune in court, smirking as their pet judge rigged the game against me. They thought my silence was fear. They were wrong. It was ammunition, because they didn't know about the box I found deep in storage. The moment I stood up, what I said left the judge pale, trembling in her robes, and my mom absolutely silent. This wasn't just a defense. It was a demolition. That morning, the courtroom in Silver Lake Heights felt colder than physics should allow. The air held the sterile, suffocating scent of wood polish and old tension, as if the very walls were holding their breath, waiting to pick a side in a war that had started decades ago. I could hear the distinct, rhythmic clicking of camera shutters somewhere behind me, their flashes reflecting sharply off the brass nameplate perched high on the bench that read, Judge Lydia Thorne. To the public, she was a pillar of justice. To me, she was simply my mother's oldest friend. Across the aisle, Mayor Victoria Sterling sat with the posture of a monarch on a throne. Every inch of her was rehearsed, from the precise wave of her hair to the way her chin lifted with that practiced political grace she reserved for voters and cameras. Beside her sat my father, Arthur Sterling. He stared fixedly at the grain of the table, avoiding my gaze entirely, as if he believed that guilt, if disguised as silence, would eventually disappear. He was shrinking in real time, a man hollowed out by years of compliance. Victoria's attorney, Marcus Hale, arranged his documents with the terrifying calm of a man who already knew the ending of the story. He didn't look like a lawyer. He looked like an executioner in a bespoke suit. He leaned over to Victoria, whispering something that made the corner of her mouth twitch upward. Not a smile, but an acknowledgement of impending victory. Then came the words that pierced deeper than any legal claim, spoken loudly enough for the press in the back row to scribble down. This girl, Victoria said, her voice dripping with a curated sadness, only knows how to waste what she doesn't deserve. That girl was me, Serena. The daughter she had ignored for years, treated like a smudge on a pristine lens. Now, suddenly, I was the only obstacle standing between her and the substantial fortune my grandmother, Margaret Maggie Vance, had left entirely to me. It wasn't the greed that chilled me to the bone in that moment. It was the ease with which my mother performed cruelty. To her, destroying her daughter wasn't personal. It was just another campaign stop. Judge Thorne nodded faintly at Victoria's comment, a movement so subtle it could have been mistaken for a muscle spasm. But I saw it, and Marcus Hale smiled, that small, confident smirk of men who think their connections outrank the truth. If you have ever watched someone twist family into a weapon, if you have ever felt the weight of a parent's betrayal, you will want to hear what came next. Because what followed in that courtroom didn't just decide the fate of an inheritance, it rewrote the history of a town that thought it could control everything, including the truth. To understand why I stood in that courtroom alone, you have to understand where I came from. Childhood never felt like the beginning of anything for me. It felt like an extended waiting period in a house built for someone else's ambitions. Silver Lake Heights was perfect on the outside. The lawns were trimmed to the millimeter, the families were polished to a shine, and the driveways were filled with cars that cost more than most people's education. But inside the Sterling residence, affection was rationed like an expensive, imported perfume used sparingly, and only when guests were present. My mother, Victoria Sterling, treated warmth as a strategy. A hug was a photo opportunity. A kind word was a deposit in a bank of favors she might need later. My father, Arthur, lived in the quiet, dusty spaces her ambition left behind. I learned before I could even read that silence pleased her. Approval didn't come from being smart or kind. It came from stillness, obedience, and invisibility. I became a ghost in my own home, gliding through hallways to avoid disturbing the important work happening in her study. But Margaret Vance, my grandmother, never asked for quiet to love me. Maggie was the antithesis of her daughter. She carried sunlight into every room she entered, smelling not of chemicals and ambition, but of jasmine and old paper. Her hands were steady, weathered by gardening and writing. Her laughter was unfiltered and loud, and her kindness was deliberate. She didn't just perform goodness, she practiced it. She used to say, "Serena, money should serve a purpose, not pride." Maggie had founded the Vance Arts Conservancy, a foundation dedicated to funding local artists and students who couldn't afford tuition. I used to follow her to the conservancy office every weekend, but inside the Sterling residence, affection was rationed like an expensive, imported perfume used sparingly, and only when guests were present. My mother, Victoria Sterling, treated warmth as a strategy. A hug was a photo opportunity. A kind word was a deposit in a bank of favors she might need later. My father, Arthur, lived in the quiet, dusty spaces her ambition left behind. I learned before I could even read that silence pleased her. Approval didn't come from being smart or kind. It came from stillness, obedience, and invisibility. I became a ghost in my own home, gliding through hallways to avoid disturbing the important work happening in her study. But Margaret Vance, my grandmother, never asked for quiet to love me. Maggie was the antithesis of her daughter. She carried sunlight into every room she entered, smelling not of chemicals and ambition, but of jasmine and old paper. Her hands were steady, weathered by gardening and writing. Her laughter was unfiltered and loud, and her kindness was deliberate. She didn't just perform goodness, she practiced it. She used to say, "Serena, money should serve a purpose, not pride." Maggie had founded the Vance Arts Conservancy, a foundation dedicated to funding local artists and students who couldn't afford tuition. I used to follow her to the conservancy office every weekend. The walls there weren't covered with awards or photos of politicians. They were covered with the messy, vibrant art of the students she had helped. "They remind me why we're here," she once told me, adjusting a framed sketch of a charcoal bird. "We plant trees under whose shade we do not expect to sit." I didn't fully understand the chasm between them back then, but I do now. Victoria and Margaret shared nothing but blood. My mother saw generosity as a weakness, a leak in the hull of her ship. My grandmother saw it as a duty, the wind in her sails. When election seasons arrived, Victoria turned into a stage version of herself. She adopted perfect posture, a rehearsed smile that didn't reach her eyes, and gave speeches about family values she never practiced at home. Margaret stayed away from those events. She called them theater for the gullible. Their distance became permanent long before I was old enough to choose sides. Margaret never flaunted her wealth, but she had plenty. Years of quiet, shrewd investments in tech and real estate made her independent in a way my mother couldn't control. That independence irritated Victoria more than poverty ever would have. She couldn't threaten Maggie, she couldn't buy her, and she couldn't silence her. But time is the one thing even the strongest women cannot fight. When the forgetting began, it was small, misplacing keys to the conservatory, repeating stories about her childhood, losing track of which day of the week it was. At first, I blamed age. I wanted to believe she was just tired. Then, the doctor said the word Alzheimer's, and my world tilted on its axis. I was 22. While my mother was busy planning her run for mayor, calculating polling numbers and donor lists, Margaret sold her large estate and moved into a smaller cottage at the edge of town. I didn't hesitate. I packed my bags and moved in with her. Victoria didn't argue. In fact, she seemed relieved. Having a saintly daughter caring for the elderly was a convenient narrative for her campaign. She didn't care about the reality of the disease. She only cared about how it looked on a brochure. She didn't know that those years in the cottage would be the most important education of my life. Those 2 years in the cottage became my education in love. It was a curriculum written in small moments, rather than grand gestures. Margaret's mind flickered like an old film projector, skipping scenes and losing focus. But the tone of the movie never changed. She remained gentle even as the plot of her life dissolved. Even when she forgot my name, calling me the nice girl with the tea, she smiled as if her heart still recognized the rhythm of my presence. She would sit by the window, humming old jazz songs while I paid the bills and cooked dinner. The scent of jasmine tea always lingering in the air like a second skin. I learned patience from the repetition of questions asked and answered a dozen times an hour. I learned courage from the exhaustion that settled deep in my bones. And most importantly, I learned grace from watching a brilliant woman fade without a single ounce of bitterness. She never raged against the dying of the light. She simply lit a candle and waited. In contrast, my mother, Mayor Victoria Sterling, visited only when the cameras did. She treated her mother's illness like a subplot in her re-election narrative. She would sweep into the small cottage bringing photographers, elaborate floral arrangements that smelled too sweet, and a performance of concern so polished it shone. The nurses whispered about her. They noted how she stood near the bed just long enough for the shutter to click, her hand resting on Margaret's frail shoulder as if testing the ripeness of fruit. To Victoria, presentation equaled affection. If it looked like care on Instagram, it was care. I stayed silent during these invasions because anger was useless against someone who had turned guilt into a branding strategy. I washed the teacups she left behind and smoothed the sheets she had wrinkled, erasing her presence the moment the campaign van pulled away. The final winter was the quietest of my life. The snow piled high against the cottage walls, insulating us from the noise of Silver Lake Heights. Margaret spoke less, slept more, and held my hand for hours, her grip surprisingly strong. It was during one of those long, silent nights that I found her old notebooks tucked away in a cedar chest. They were filled with letters she never sent, recipes for plum cake, and drafts of speeches she never gave. Buried at the bottom of the chest was a heavy, cream-colored envelope sealed with wax. The label read simply, "For Serena." My hands trembled as I broke the seal. Inside was a handwritten letter and a notarized will. It wasn't complicated legalese. It was clear, deliberate, and final. She left everything, her estate, her substantial savings, and the Vance Arts Conservancy to me, but it was the letter that made my breath hitch in my throat. In her wavering script, she had written, "Kindness must be inherited the same way money is, Serena. Without one, the other vanishes. Do not let them turn you into a statue. Remain a gardener." She passed away early that spring, just as the crocuses were pushing through the frost. The house felt suddenly cavernous without her humming. But strangely, I didn't cry immediately. Grief had been living with me as a roommate for months already. We were old friends by then. I organized the funeral alone, choosing the hymns she loved and the flowers she had grown, while the rest of the town waited for the official press release from the mayor's office. Elaine, or rather, Mayor Victoria Sterling, arrived at the funeral in black silk that cost more than the casket. She greeted donors and city council members with a camera-ready sorrow that was terrifying to behold. She moved through the church like a shark in dark water, shaking hands and dabbing at dry eyes with a lace handkerchief. When she took the podium to deliver the eulogy, the air in the church shifted. She didn't speak about Margaret's love for jazz or her terrible cooking. Instead, she spoke about legacy, family unity, and civic duty. She turned her mother's life into a political endorsement for her own administration. The applause that followed was polite, rhythmic, and hollow. It made my stomach twist. I sat in the front row, staring at the wood grain of the pew, realizing that to my mother, a funeral was just a fundraiser with a body. For a brief period after the burial, peace existed in the form of paperwork. I managed the estate, answered hundreds of condolence cards, and began running the Vance Arts Conservancy. I felt closer to Margaret there. Surrounded by the art she loved, I thought the worst was over. I thought I would be allowed to grieve in the quiet life I had chosen. Then, an envelope appeared at my door, bearing the embossed gold logo of Hale and Associates, my mother's high-powered legal firm. Someone had told her about the will. That evening, Victoria arrived at the cottage without warning. I remember the sharp, aggressive click of her heels on the hardwood floor, a sound that signaled an invasion. She didn't take off her coat. She stood in the center of the living room, the space where Margaret had spent her final peaceful days, and threw the legal notice onto the coffee table. The mask of public grace she wore for the voters slid off her face, revealing something sharper and colder than grief. Her eyes were hard, calculating, stripping the room of its warmth. "You think you can just take it?" she asked, her voice low and dangerous. "You think you deserve this empire?" "It's not an empire, Mother," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "It's a legacy." And she left it to me. Victoria laughed. A harsh, dry sound. She told me I was incompetent. She told me I was a caregiver, a servant, not a leader. She looked at me not as her daughter, but as a mistake standing between her and total control of the Vance fortune. Power doesn't mourn, I realized in that moment. It plots. That was the day the last thread of connection between us snapped. I realized that love in our family had skipped a generation, leaping over Victoria to land safely with me. The woman standing in my living room wasn't a grieving daughter. She was a politician facing a budget deficit, and I was the bank she intended to rob. What remained in the silence of that room was the beginning of a war I hadn't chosen, but one I would have to finish. She turned and walked out, the door slamming shut behind her with the finality of a gavel. By early autumn, the peace of Silver Lake Heights had become a rumor. The hills around the town glowed with golden leaves, pretending to be calm, but tension coiled underneath the surface like a snake. My mother had found her rhythm again, not in motherhood, but in warfare, disguised as politics. It began with whispers that grew their own legs. Then came the articles. They were masterpieces of manipulation, dressed up as investigative journalism but engineered like traps. Headlines like "Daughter Inherits Fortune Amid Family Concerns" began to circulate. Every line suggested I had manipulated a senile old woman. Each photo of me was grainy and unflattering, placed beside words like greed, coercion, and betrayal. In Silver Lake Heights, rumor was currency, and Mayor Victoria Sterling was the wealthiest woman in town. She crafted sympathy like policy. She didn't attack me directly. She let the town do it for her. My father called once, his voice cautious and thin, asking if I could resolve things quietly by giving Victoria control of the trust. He sounded like a man trying to bargain with a hurricane. I ended the call gently. Grief was no longer my weakness. It had turned into armor. I hired Evelyn Sharp not because she was kind, but because she was terrifying. Her office was located in a brutalist concrete building on the edge of the financial district, far removed from the manicured lawns of Silver Lake Heights. Evelyn didn't offer me tea or sympathy when I walked in. She offered me process. She was a woman of sharp angles and sharper intellect, who viewed the law not as a moral crusade but as a complex architectural problem waiting to be solved. "They don't want to win in court, Serena," she said during our first meeting, sliding a thin pair of spectacles up her nose. "They want to bankrupt you before you ever get there. They want to drain the estate until there's nothing left to fight for." Her first instruction was simple: document everything. The goal wasn't to fight emotion with emotion, which is a losing battle against a narcissist like my mother. The goal was to fight pressure with precision. Soon, the envelopes began arriving daily: legal threats, demands for medical records, insinuations of elder abuse, and undue influence. Each letter from Hale and Associates was designed to exhaust me, to make me question my own sanity. My mother's campaign machine was operating at full capacity. While her lawyers tried to bleed the inheritance dry with frivolous motions, Victoria smiled on television. Her campaign commercials dripped with sincerity. She stood in front of the local high school, speaking passionately about protecting family heritage and honoring the values of our elders. The same hand that signed motions to strip me of my home was gesturing about morality to the voters. Silver Lake Heights applauded her story. I became the villain in her narrative, the ungrateful daughter. The contrast that made her light shine brighter. Reporters began camping outside the Vance Arts Conservancy, pretending to care about the art. They asked leading questions about the scandal overshadowing the work my grandmother had dedicated her life to. Through the noise, Evelyn stayed unshaken. "Facts," she reminded me, "age better than rumors." So we started collecting them. My dining room table disappeared under stacks of old bank statements, donation records, and foundation archives. I spent my nights highlighting names and dates, looking for discrepancies. The more we gathered, the clearer the pattern became. It wasn't just a family dispute. It was a systemic network of favors. One name appeared too often to ignore: Judge Lydia Thorne. At first, I dismissed it as coincidence. Silver Lake Heights was a small ecosystem. The elite overlapped. But Evelyn found something the public records had missed. She uncovered a series of consistent, personal donations from Judge Thorne to Victoria's past 3 mayoral campaigns. Each donation was meticulously calculated to be just $1 below the public reporting threshold. Curiosity turned into certainty. I began digging through online archives, buried social media posts from campaign staffers, and local news photos from a decade ago. Again and again, they appeared side by side at fundraisers, private dinners, and charity galas. Their smiles looked natural, practiced, synchronized. These weren't glimpses of professional courtesy. They were evidence of comfort. It was a connection strong enough to blur the lines between the judiciary and the executive. My grandmother used to say, "Integrity doesn't erode overnight, Serena. It dissolves quietly, like sugar in tea, until the reflection in the mirror belongs to someone else. That is exactly what I saw in those photos. When public slander failed to break me, the threats shifted tone. The anonymous messages started arriving, emails warning me to think carefully about my future, voicemails breathing silence before hanging up. One night, a black sedan with tinted windows lingered outside the gate of the cottage for hours, the engine idling low and menacing in the dark. Fear tried to introduce itself, to make me pack my bags and run, but I had learned discipline from caregiving. I knew how to find stillness under chaos. Evelyn insisted we stay silent publicly. If you speak now, they'll use your defense as a confession, she said. Let them think you're scared. Let them think you're weak. So, we worked quietly, layering facts like bricks. My living room no longer looked like a home. It looked like a war room. I pinned timelines across a corkboard, connecting my mother's rise to power with the judge's favorable rulings in other cases involving city contracts. It wasn't just about my inheritance anymore. It was a blueprint of corruption. Victoria's empire ran on control. Mine would run on patience. She had always won by being louder. I would win by being exact. Each document became its own verdict. Each photo was a mirror she couldn't escape. The final, damning connection arrived one rainy Tuesday evening while I was scouring a forgotten event archive from the Silver Lake Civic Jubilee. An event from 12 years ago. Judge Lydia Thorne hadn't just attended Victoria's first campaign kickoff. She had officiated the private fundraising dinner. Her signature sat right beside my mother's on the sponsor list, the ink preserved in glossy print. It was small, elegant, and absolutely devastating. Judicial ethics rules were clear. A judge cannot solicit funds or publicly endorse a political candidate. But there she was, not just endorsing, but hosting. I stared at the evidence under the glow of my desk lamp. The light painted my hands pale, steady, and deliberate. Somewhere between the fear and the fatigue, a realization surfaced. This wasn't about the money. It wasn't about the house or the art collection. It was about exposure. For years, Victoria had built a machine that shaped perception, a machine that ground people down until they fit her narrative. Now, that same machine had left a trail too intricate to erase. The pressure she designed to crush me was starting to crack the foundation of her own life instead. I called Evelyn immediately. She picked up on the first ring. "I have it," I whispered, my voice rough with lack of sleep. "I have the link. Bring it to me," Evelyn said, her tone devoid of excitement but heavy with satisfaction. "And Serena, don't stop digging. If there's a fundraiser, there's a ledger." She was right. What I had uncovered wasn't just corruption born from desperation or a one-time lapse in judgment. It was architecture. It was built over years, steady and deliberate. It explained why every door I'd tried to knock on in this town had closed politely in my face. The network wasn't protecting my mother's innocence. It was protecting its own convenience. I realized then that the wall I was building wasn't just a defense. It was containment. I was building a cage, and I was going to lock them both inside it with the truth they thought they had buried. Morning arrived without promise. The sky was a pale, bruised sheet of gray above Silver Lake Heights, its color indifferent to the storm, moving quietly beneath it. Inside the cottage, the air was thick with the scent of stale coffee and printer ink. "Every battle needs structure," Evelyn had said. I took her advice literally. My living room had ceased to be a place of rest. It was now a war room. Folders were stacked like bricks along the walls. Timelines were pinned across a corkboard that spanned the length of the hallway, and photos were marked in neat, surgical columns. I didn't need rage to fight anymore. I needed rhythm. Each document I touched felt heavier than paper. They carried years of my mother's entitlement, the fingerprints of a system designed to protect her at the expense of everyone else. Mayor Victoria Sterling wasn't just a mother defending her family's pride. She was a public figure defending an image. And in Silver Lake Heights, image had rules sharper than law. By late winter, our case stood ready. Evelyn assembled the evidence into sequences even a biased mind couldn't ignore. I memorized every exhibit, every timestamp, every name. When fear tried to speak to me in the quiet hours of the night, I replaced it with data. Somewhere in that discipline, the balance of power began to shift. My mother's campaign looked flawless from the outside billboards on every corner, interviews on the morning news, but internally, her control was cracking. Evelyn's investigators found that anonymous resignations were surfacing from her staff. 2 major sponsors had quietly withdrawn their support, citing ethical concerns after receiving vague inquiries about their ties to the judge. Victoria's silence grew louder, and silence was the one thing I had learned to read perfectly. The wall I built was complete. It wasn't made of bricks, but of truth. It was so meticulously arranged that it could withstand anything built on pretense. And as the court date approached, I finally understood the quiet satisfaction my grandmother Margaret must have felt in every act of patience. Because revenge, when built carefully, doesn't shout. It stands. The morning of the hearing felt sterile, like time itself had been disinfected. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited with their lenses raised like weapons, hungry for the fall of a dynasty. I walked past them without stopping, ignoring the shouted questions about my mental state and my betrayal. Inside, the silence had weight. The courtroom smelled of varnished wood mixed with something colder anticipation. I took my seat beside Evelyn, breathing in the stillness that comes before a verdict. Mayor Victoria Sterling sat across the aisle, wrapped in a composure too perfect to be real. She wore a suit of soft ivory, a color chosen to evoke innocence. Her lawyer, Marcus Hale, arranged his notes with theatrical precision, snapping his briefcase shut with a sound that echoed like a shot. Between them, power hummed like electricity behind glass. At the bench, Judge Lydia Thorne looked poised, almost detached. She adjusted her robes, her face a mask of impartial authority. Only I knew the fault line beneath her calm. Years of entanglement dressed as friendship. The air itself seemed aware of it. When the proceedings began, Marcus Hale spoke in the rhythm of manipulation. He didn't sound like a lawyer arguing a probate case. He sounded like a disappointed uncle. His arguments were rehearsed to sound humane, an appeal to morality rather than greed. "Your Honor," he began, pacing slowly before the bench. "We are not here to punish Serena. We are here to protect her. She is a young woman, grief-stricken, misguided, and frankly, too inexperienced to understand the burden of the vast estate Mrs. Vance left behind. The mayor simply wishes to guide the assets until her daughter is ready." Every phrase was designed to shrink me into something fragile. He painted me as unstable, a girl who had taken advantage of her grandmother's dementia to rewrite a will. I didn't react. I kept my hands folded on the table, my spine straight. Evelyn had taught me the discipline of stillness. "Let them exhaust themselves first," she had said. The hearing stretched like an elastic band. The clock on the wall ticked without mercy, each minute pulling tighter. I could feel the audience in the gallery shifting, their sympathy being molded by Marcus's tone, rather than the truth. That was my mother's greatest talent. Performance mistaken for sincerity. When her turn came, Victoria took the stand. She delivered what sounded less like testimony and more like a campaign speech. She spoke of community, sacrifice, and a daughter who had lost her way. "I only want what is best for Serena," Victoria said, her voice trembling at exactly the right moment. She wiped a non-existent tear from her cheek. My mother, God rest her soul, was confused in her final months. She would never have wanted to burden a young girl with the management of the Arts Conservancy. It requires experienced hands. To anyone who didn't know her, it would have been moving. To me, it was choreography. She looked at me with sad, doe-like eyes, but I saw the shark swimming behind them. Then, it was my turn. "Call your witness," Judge Thorne said, her voice bored, as if the ruling was already typed up in her chambers. I rose, carrying the thick black folder that had become both my shield and my sword. The room seemed to shrink as I walked to the witness table. The light above the judge's bench reflected on the polished floor like a warning. "Facts don't need volume," Evelyn's voice echoed in my memory. "They only need sequence." I placed the folder on the stand. I didn't look at the gallery. I didn't look at my father. I looked directly at Judge Thorne. "Miss Sterling," the judge said, peering over her glasses, "do you have a statement regarding the claims of undue influence?" "I have records, Your Honor," I said. My voice was quiet, but it carried to the back of the room. Records that clarify the relationship between the estate, the mayor's campaign, and this court. Marcus Hale stood up halfway, sensing a shift in the wind. "Objection. Relevance. Foundation." Evelyn shot back from her seat, cool as ice. "Go ahead, Serena." I opened the first file. "Exhibit A," I stated. "Donation records." Each exhibit built upon the last. I laid them out like tarot cards, correspondence between the mayor's office and the judge's private chambers, dates of transfers, the overlapping boards of charities that didn't exist. Every layer revealed the quiet, suffocating network between the judge and my mother. "No accusations, Your Honor," I said, sliding a document across the smooth wood. "Just alignment. Patterns so precise they don't need interpretation." I could feel the oxygen leaving the room. Marcus Hale's pen stopped moving. Victoria's perfect posture stiffened. They were waiting for the connection, the smoking gun. I reached for the final photograph. It was the one I had found under the desk lamp, the one that turned a hunch into a verdict. "And finally," I said, holding the image face down for a moment, "a photograph from the Silver Lake Civic Jubilee, 12 years ago." I slid it across the table toward the judge. "It shows the officiating host of Mayor Sterling's first fundraising committee." The silence that followed felt alive. The photograph lay on the bench like a grenade with the pin pulled. For a fraction of a second, the judge's control fractured. Her breath caught in her throat, a small, sharp sound that the microphone amplified for the entire room to hear. Her hand trembled as she reached for her water glass, the ice clinking against the crystal in a erratic rhythm that betrayed her terror. Then, like instinct, she looked at my mother. It wasn't a look of friendship anymore, it was a look of panic. In that split second, the unspoken contract between them dissolved. Self-preservation is a powerful solvent. Judge Lydia Thorne realized that if she ruled against me now, with this evidence sitting on the public record, she wouldn't just lose her reputation. She would lose her freedom. She nodded, a stiff, mechanical motion, agreeing with the silence rather than speaking. That tiny motion was enough. The mask cracked in public view. I didn't need to say another word. The truth had spoken through posture, through reaction, through the small betrayal of human instinct. Evelyn Sharp stood up, her voice cutting through the tension like a scalpel. Motion for immediate recusal, Your Honor, and a motion to dismiss all claims against the estate with prejudice. The courtroom froze as the judge struggled to recover her composure. But professionalism couldn't undo what the audience had already seen. Ruth O'Connor's ruling was swift, mechanical, and stripped of all her previous confidence. She didn't recuse herself. She tried to end it before it could get worse. The court finds no evidence of undue influence, she stammered, her voice wavering through the closing statement. The will of Margaret Vance is upheld in its entirety. Case dismissed. Each word was an act of damage control. A desperate attempt to sweep the debris under the rug. Victoria's face remained still. But the stillness was different this time. It wasn't strategy. It was shock. Control had always been her religion, her currency, and her oxygen. I had just turned her faith into evidence and spent it all in one afternoon. When the gavel fell, the sound echoed like closure made physical. It was the sound of a heavy door slamming shut on a lifetime of manipulation. The reporters moved first, a chaotic wave chasing quotes and chaos. They surged toward the defense table, their flashes blinding. I didn't move. I watched my mother stand, her expression flickering between disbelief and calculation. She looked at me across the aisle, searching for the scared little girl she used to ignore. She didn't find her. That moment, the second she realized the narrative was no longer hers to write, was the quietest victory I'd ever known. The days that followed blurred together, stitched by headlines and static. The courthouse emptied, but its echo stayed with me. Outside, reporters turned fragments of my story into currency, printing photos of the secret alliance between the mayor and the judge. Inside the cottage, the silence of victory felt too heavy to celebrate. Winning never sounded like triumph to me. It sounded like a clock finally exhaling after holding its breath for too long. Judge Lydia Thorne submitted her resignation within a week, citing personal health reasons. The statement was short, but the consequences were long. The State Judicial Review Board opened an inquiry before the ink on her resignation letter had dried. Each report revealed another thread: campaign donations, private appearances, favoritism disguised as philanthropy. Her name, once etched in brass, became shorthand for compromised ethics. Mayor Victoria Sterling followed quickly down the same slope. The Silver Lake Heights City Council launched an internal ethics review. Donors evaporated like mist. Former allies turned their backs to distance themselves from the blast radius. Her campaign office, once a bustling hive of activity on Main Street, closed overnight. I drove past it one evening and saw the windows papered over with blank white sheets where her slogans used to be. Her social media feeds filled with silence. For a woman who had built her life on visibility, disappearance was the cruelest sentence imaginable. I read none of the coverage. Evelyn handled everything, filing the closing motions and archiving every document for future reference. She told me we had done more than win. We had exposed a pattern. Exposure burns. She told me, handing me the final deed to the estate, but it cauterizes the wound. At night, I felt the burn most sharply. My phone buzzed with congratulations from people who hadn't spoken to me in years. I didn't know how to answer them. Gratitude felt misplaced. Revenge felt hollow. Justice, I realized, is quieter than people imagine. It doesn't roar. It releases. In Silver Lake Heights, people began rewriting their allegiances. The same voices that once praised my mother's leadership now praised accountability. The shift was surgical, impersonal, and inevitable. Politics doesn't apologize. It simply adapts to the new winner. I stood on the porch of the cottage a few days later, watching the sun set over the hills. The steps looked different. Though they were unchanged, I realized places never hold the weight of memory. People do, and those who carry truth eventually have to set it down. Not because they are done fighting, but because they are tired of carrying it alone. Evelyn's office called with the final confirmations. The estate was officially mine. Every property, every share, every dollar my grandmother had entrusted to me. The law had spoken. There was nothing left to contest. Yet, the moment I signed the last page, I didn't feel wealth. I felt gravity. My grandmother's handwriting flashed through my memory. The ink on that letter she left in the cedar chest. Kindness must outlive fear. The phrase echoed in quiet defiance of everything my mother had stood for. Victoria never reached out. No apology, no denial, not even anger. Her silence felt strategic at first. A pause before the next attack. But later, I understood it for what it was. It was the absence of power. She had no language for a world where she wasn't in control, so she simply ceased to speak. The news cycle moved on, as it always does, finding new scandals and new heroes. But in the quiet rooms of the Vance Arts Conservancy, amidst the smell of jasmine and old paper, I finally found the beginning of my own life.